John Gummer was first elected as an MP in 1970 and was the MP for the Suffolk Coastal constituency from 1979 until 2010. And during that time, he held a number of government appointments. He was a member of the cabinet from 1989 to 1997, becoming Secretary of State for the Environment in 1993. The BBC Wildlife magazine described him as the Environment Secretary against which all others are judged, placing him as one of the top environmental heroes. In 1997, he was awarded the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds Medal and was described by Friends of the Earth as the best Environment Secretary we've ever had. In 2010, he was appointed a member of the House of Lords, taking the title of Lord Deben from the River Deben, which flows through his former constituency. In 2012, he was appointed as chairman of the UK's independent Committee on Climate Change, a position he held until last year. The committee advises the UK and devolved governments on setting and meeting carbon budgets and on preparing for the impacts of climate change, and reports to Parliament on progress made in reducing greenhouse emissions. 6 months ago, having heard Lord Deben speak at Aberforth, I approached him after Mass at our lovely little Catholic church in Framlingham and asked if he'd consider speaking to the lay community of St. Benedict. And so we are delighted that he has agreed to speak to us this evening on the theme of this year's Season of Creation, to hope and act with creation. Lord Deben, you are most welcome, and we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say to us.
I'm sorry, would you like to unmute? We can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay, is that better? Can you now hear me?
We can, thank you very much.
Right. Well, I want to start with Genesis because it seems to me that it's there in creation itself that we can begin to understand what we should think about. And we remember that the tree of knowledge meant that humanity knew, and therefore they were responsible. Until then, they weren't responsible. And I think it's crucial for us to understand that knowledge brings responsibility. And perhaps the comparison that one might want to make is with the Black Death. Black Death killed 1 in 3 of much of the world. And yet no one knew why. So we weren't responsible. Indeed, we did all the wrong things, as a matter of fact, gathering together and giving it to each other. But that was not our responsibility because we didn't know. And the problem for all of us is that knowledge, because it brings responsibility, is something that when it's inconvenient, the inconvenient truth, which was after all the title of that great film, which was produced in order to show what climate change meant. When we know, the first thing we try to do, if the knowledge is inconvenient, is to pretend that we don't know. And that, of course, has been the mechanism by which we have put off acting on climate change and recreating the world in which we live. What we said is, well, we're not quite sure. Perhaps it's something else. We don't really want to accept the truth. And ignorance is the best place to go if you don't want to accept the truth. And the problem with that is that you are denying the basic issue of being human. When we know we are responsible, once we're responsible, we have to do something about it. So the second of the two words that we're thinking of today, act, is very clear. Because we know, we have to act. And that knowledge, of course, is also very simple. You can go back to the first science that any of us learnt at school, which was that the world was too hot to have life as we know it. And then gradually, with the emergence of trees and bushes, we drew out of the atmosphere the carbon, which meant that gradually the temperature fell. And first fishes, and then reptiles, and then finally mammals and human beings emerged. We were cool enough to be able to live. And then, of course, those trees and bushes laid down the carbon that they'd taken out of the atmosphere. They laid it down in coal and oil and gas. And about 200 years ago, we began to put it all back into the atmosphere. We burnt the coal. We used the gas and the oil. And it's not, therefore, very surprising that if the temperature falls when you take carbon out of the atmosphere, it's likely to rise when you put it back. And that's exactly what has happened. We've never had anything in history which is as dramatic as the change in temperatures over the last 200 years. We know that because you can go down into the ice, and rather like looking at the rings on a tree, you can see each year how the ice is laid down. And some years it's thicker because it's colder, and some years it's thinner because it was not quite so cold. And you can see there the ups and downs of the warm periods and the cold periods. But for the last 200 years, there's something that interrupts the whole of this, much bigger, much more continuous. And that is very simply the temperature increase and the increase of carbon in the atmosphere. Because in that ice, unlike the rings of the trees, there are little globules which hold the air of the time and show how much carbon there was in it. So here we are with the fastest rising temperature we've ever had, and also with the increase of carbon being thrown off by the world in a way which we've never seen before. And we know that. And because we know it, we have to deal with it. So what is it that we have to do? We have, first of all, to face up to the huge demand that we, and honor and privilege, which we as human beings have. Because we are partners in creation. It seems to me that one of the real problems with our life is that it is trivialized by people. At the very heart of our understanding is the fact that unlike any other animal, we know how you conceive life. We know what you do to do it. We have a responsibility for it, which is why the church is right to take such a very high view of our responsibility when it comes to the creation of life. Because we are partners. Knowledge has made us a partner with the Almighty in creation. And for that reason, we have to understand just how serious is the way in which we have distorted our power. in the Holy Father's Laudato Si, you have a restatement of what the Church has always taught. It has always taught that we should be stewards of creation. It has always taught that we should accept that although we have domination over creation, that doesn't mean that we should be tyrants. It demands of us not tyrannical behavior, but stewardship. And the problem that we have now reached is that we have damaged the very creation of which we are part. And we've damaged it to a degree so remarkably important that it is close to destruction. I always wonder about Laudato Si. The Pope could almost have said, we told you so, because there's nothing new in Laudato Si at all. It's brilliantly written. It's a remarkable piece of work, but it could be just saying, this is what the Church has always taught. And at its heart is an understanding that climate change is the symptom of what we've done to the world. And that is, first of all, to pollute the world. We've polluted the seas, the rivers, the earth, and the air. Our earth, upon which we depend for our food and for everything, is now less fecund than it has ever been. It reduced its fertility to a remarkable extent. And as a result of what we've done, we've also changed the climate in which we have to live. The increase in temperatures means that we have these huge changes. This last year, the hottest year on record, beating the year before. Every month for the last 2 years has been a record month for heat. If you compare it with all that months, all the Mays before, all the Junes before, all the Septembers before, the record month has always been the month in the last 2 years. So we now have a situation which is entirely non-analogous. It has never happened before. And in that sense, we have to recognize these huge changes. So at the moment, when we're sitting here, people all over Asia and all over Southern Europe and over most of the Americas are either experiencing or looking back on the most disastrous period of heat. Anybody who's been abroad to Southern Europe this year knows that it has been too hot. Those wildfire fires ravaging the whole area around Athens and throughout Greece, the reduction in the amount of water that is there, the fact that they now have to ration water in Sicily and in Sardinia. For the first time, this is what these huge changes mean. Storm Babette, which we had last year, flooded places which have never been flooded before. So what is happening in the big world is that we are being threatened, not just as a species, the human species, but the animals for which we are responsible, the plants which we have been given, the whole of the creation which we have been given and with which we are charged to look after. But it's not only the big things. I often think that people find all that rather difficult, not so much to understand or to take as truth, but just to be able to put their arms around it. So let me give you one tiny example. There are 250 species of bumblebees. Bumblebees are only found in the northern climes. What we now know is that because of the increase in heat in these northern climes, bumblebees cannot smell as they used to. The amount of ability to pick up the scent of flowers essential for the bumblebee to eat, to take nourishment, is now reduced very significantly. So the bumblebee can easily be our sign. Jesus was very, very adept at picking up things that people really understand. And the bumblebee is something all of us can understand. Bumblebee is threatened not only by the loss of habitat, not only because of the misuse of chemicals in our agricultural system, both of which are terrible enough, but the bumblebee is also now threatened because it can't smell well enough to find the flowers which it will pollinate and play its part in creation, but also which will give it the food that it needs. So my dilemma always is, actually, is how much you can talk about the horrific effects of climate change before you make people feel that there is no hope, that they may as well eat and drink and be merry because tomorrow they die. And that, of course, is the problem for the secular world. For Christians, there is that fundamental concept of hope. And hope is not a wet view of saying, well, somehow or other something will turn out. Hope is the means whereby we act. We can act because we know that if we act properly, then the commitment of our Heavenly Father to protect us and the rainbow that reminds us of his promise is something upon which we can depend. And the problem is that we've got to learn to live in a different way. Of course, it's not all that different for Christians, because it's very much the way which we have always said we are designed to live. Because human beings are always too big for their boots. It's the downside of so much that is important about humanity. It's the downside of having inquisitive, creative natures, questioning, looking for answers, and being able to use our brains to achieve so much. That's the downside. The downside of that is thereby believing that we are gods. That takes us back to Genesis, which is what exactly the Almighty said. Said that they now are like gods. And that's what we have done. We have so controlled the world, we have so overcome all the obstacles in the world that we have begun to believe that we know it all. And just to remind us of how wrong that is, let me ask you to think of two of the great successes, or at least the things we thought were the great successes, which turned out to be hugely damaging. We invented something called DDT. And DDT was something which was going to revolutionize the ability of mankind to feed itself. What we didn't realize was that it poisoned everything that came in contact with it. Not immediately, but it did in fact ultimately mean that it would destroy the very creation which we were hoping to enhance. And we've done it again. Neonicotinoids, this wonderful chemical which was going to help us deal with all sorts of problems. What we didn't really understand is that if a bee takes any kind of touch of this chemical, it can't find its way home. Very simply, it affects its nervous system. And what we've done is to introduce something which actually destroys the very circularity of the earth, because the bee is carrying pollen from flower to flower. The bee is responsible for a very high proportion of the fertility of all our crops. If you kill the bee, you kill off that fertility. And so our problem has been that we've been clever enough to control the world. We drove great tunnels through the mountains. We overcame all the issues which we had been fearing, and we thought that we'd overcome everything with the use of chemicals on our land, that we thought we had overcome everything because we could find every fish and catch it. We thought we had overcome everything because we could move faster than any animal. We thought we were masters of the world. And what we discovered was that that mastery, unguided by an understanding of the role we have as stewards, that mastery was in fact the route to total destruction. And the trouble with us lot is that we're unwilling to admit our faults. The international company which has done more damage to this world than any other is ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil is still telling people that we're going to use as much fossil fuel in 2050 as we are now. It manages to say that at the same time as saying that it's going to move to net zero by 2050. Of course, the truth is, it actually knows that no person who works in a senior job for ExxonMobil will be alive in 2050, so it's not going to have to take responsibility for it. But interestingly, it still cannot admit its fault. It knows that it, among many of its peers, but above all, it has changed the world in the way in which we've taught. It knows that, but it is determined to pretend that is not so. So what we've done is to become the lords of creation, and instead of being its lordly stewards, we have become its lordly tyrants. So what we have to do is to recover our understanding of our proper place in the world. Our proper place in the world is as a steward. And in order to be a steward, we have to learn again the humility that stewards have to have. We're very clever. We have all sorts of wonderful ideas. We need them. Newman said, growth is the only evidence of life. What he meant was that we can only be alive if we can see ways of changing and improving and growing. But we have to do that in the context of looking after the earth, which is ours. And in order to do that, we have to become humble again. and be willing to recognize the wonder of what the human being can do, but recognize that we are not the creator, we are partners in creation, and our partnership is based upon our understanding of the role which we have, which is that of steward. So if we're going to talk to others, we do have not to frighten them to such a degree that they feel there is no chance of winning this battle. We have to help them to do 4 things. First, to be honest about things, to accept the facts, not to plead ignorance. Secondly, to understand that if we are honest about things and don't plead ignorance, then we have also to accept our responsibility as stewards. And thirdly, that means that we have to look at everything we do through the eyes of stewardship. That means we're going to have to make sure that we produce the energy that we need in a way which doesn't destroy the earth. We've got to put back the fecundity which we have taken from our soil. We've got to get rid of the pollution with which we have spoiled our air and despoiled our seas. We have, in other words, to start thinking in the long term, and we have to think about the world as our being part of creation instead of the tyrannical lords of creation. And the 4th thing that we have to have is hope that we can achieve these things. Now, I've been depressing about the awful effects of climate change. But if I look back, I would never have thought, 10, 12, 15, or let's say 25 years ago, when first I became convinced of the science, I would never have thought that internationally we could have moved as far and as fast as we have. The effect of climate change has been to mean that the world as a whole has committed itself to fight it. There's no other issue which the world has committed itself to fight. That's what the Paris Agreement was. There's no other issue which is the basis of international agreement, not enough, not fast enough, very much behind, but at least there is now a basis, and we can ratchet that up year after year. That's what these COPs, these curious meetings that we have twice a year, are supposed to do, and in large measure do. So we may be rightly really frightened by what we have done, but we also ought to be uplifted by the mechanisms which we have begun to create. And our job now is to make that work. And there are so many things that we can do, and I'm only going to use the most controversial because that's a good line to finish on. I started with Genesis. I want to end with today's politics. All of us have got to insist that only those politicians who are prepared to put the battle against climate change first will get our votes and get our support. There is no place for, well, let me be frank, there is no place for reform as a party in the Christian conscience. You cannot accept people who are not prepared to accept the truth, believe the facts, and get on with dealing with the problem. And that's true in the major parties too. And it's very important to say this now because we have a government which is committed to the changes which we need to make. It is very clear as to what it wants to do, and in general, its programme is extremely good. But it won't be long before the naysayers and the put-offers and the people who want to delay start getting at it. It will find life very difficult as it becomes hard to do what it is committed to. And that's the point, and that's the moment that all of us have got to support it. And it's true of its opponents too. As somebody who sits as a Conservative in the House of Lords, my job is to make sure that the Conservative Party does not move from the consensus which has held us together since the Climate Change Committee was set up and the Climate Change Act. After all, it was invented by the Conservative Party in opposition, put through with the support of all parties by a Labour government. That was the beginning. It's true that Mrs. May made net zero a statutory obligation. This is something we have done together, and we have got to make sure that it continues. I make no apology for being as vulgar as talking about politics, but the fact of the matter is that although we as Christians will support everything that's happened with our prayers and understanding, in the end, we will only deliver this if we act. And that second word, hope and act. We have to act, and we have to make sure that those who have the power to act not only do what they should do, but have the support in the difficult times when doing it is very hard.
Thank you very much, Lord Deben, for a very inspirational talk. And I'm just reminding everybody now that if you'd like to ask questions, please could you type them into the chat function, which you should see the button at the bottom of the screen on your Zoom. So do give your questions now. That would be very good. I'd like to open with an initial question. The next COP meeting, which is, I gather, in November in Azerbaijan, it says that the priority now is for this COP is finance and funding the developing countries that need support in the fight against climate change. I was wondering what you felt would be the difficulties faced by this in view of the huge financial pressures that there are in this country at the moment. How do you think politicians who are faced with managing budgets can be persuaded to part with money to support those countries that are suffering so much?
Well, first of all, I mean, you put your finger on the issue, and it might be summed up by a statement yesterday by Mr. Tice, who I understand to be the deputy leader of Reform, who said how outrageous it was that people would find their winter fuel payments cut while we were sending money abroad to fight climate change in developing countries. In other words, he was making the point which they will all make, which is we don't need to do it. We've got our own needs, and charity begins at home. That will be the line. And I think we just have to overcome it by saying three things. First, actually, if we can get the developing countries to move directly from where they are to a reasonable standard of living without the dirty in between, which is what we went through, then this is the cheapest and best way of achieving that end. The second thing is, and this is very important when you want to talk to the Mr. Tices of this world, if you think that we've had a problem with migration now, you wait until climate change gets that much worse, when millions of people around the world will have to move, not to get a better life, but to get a life at all. The whole of Bangladesh, with 200 million people, lies below sea level, and the sea levels are rising. If you go to a place like Niger, temperatures are now moving towards 50 degrees centigrade. You can't live in that kind of temperature, and they'll move. So the second reason why you have to do this is if you want it for your own selfish future, because the only way in which you can make the changes that are necessary if people are going to be able to live in their own countries is by fighting climate change. And the third thing that you have to say is this: frankly, if you're faced with an existential threat, you really do have to accept that that is the first place where you put your money.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very thorough answer. I have another question that's come up on the chat function now. It says, Lord Deben, you attended a demonstration in Aldborough in Suffolk last weekend, fighting to preserve our beautiful coast from onshore industrialisation, where green energy is produced offshore or at the proposed Sizewell C nuclear plant. How do we manage the environmental impact of green energy production, storage, and distribution?
Well, we have to manage it, and there are some things which we'll have to do which will not be very popular, like we are going to have a lot more pylons, exactly as we did after the war when we had the grid in the first place. And if people want to live the sort of lives which they wish to live, they need energy, and we'll need to carry that. The argument that I had there was an argument about the mechanisms which we can use. I believe that we should not go in for old-fashioned ways of doing this, but we should seize the technological future. And the two areas where we can do that is, one, having an undersea network, which the Belgians are already having. Of course, we have been stupid and immoral enough to leave the European Union, and that was a huge mistake, but we might as well learn a bit from some of our neighbours, and the Belgians are doing that extremely well, and they are building a system which relies not only on what we've got now, but what we will have in terms of cables in 2030 and 2035. And the same is true, actually, about Sizewell C. I supported Sizewell B, which was a necessary part of our turning from fossil fuels. But Sizewell C is not going to contribute to net zero by 2050 because it won't be there in time. It's built by a company, it will be built, if it is built, by a company that has never delivered on time or to budget, and it's old-fashioned nuclear use. I'd much prefer to spend the money on trying to have small nuclear power stations which can be built off-site and which we can use for the very small amount of need that we have for nuclear energy. All I'm asking for is to have the best ways of solving our problems and not just taking the cheapest and easiest options. And that's why I did my speech on the beach at Aldborough.
Thank you very much. We've got another one here. The Labour Party appears to have gone back on its programme towards climate change in certain respects. What specific issues should we be highlighting with our MPs?
Well, I'm not sure it's really true they have. It's all to do with whether you could actually spend that amount of money in the ways that they wanted to in the time concerned. I'm prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt on that, as a matter of fact. What we should be highlighting with our MPs is, first of all, we should look up the Friends of the Earth app, where you can see what are the particular threats of climate change in your constituency. First thing is to remind members of Parliament of what is happening to their constituencies in terms of threats from flooding, from heat, or whatever else it is. And Friends of the Earth have produced an extremely good website for that purpose. Start with the locality. Start with the things that affect voters in the constituency. And then secondly, make it absolutely clear to every member of parliament that when you go, and it doesn't matter, you should go even if your member of parliament is a really good person supporting these matters and doing their best, they need your support. I always felt very much more encouraged if you have a letter or two or a visit from somebody who actually says what you're doing is what he or she wants to be done. So often all you get are complaints about what you're doing and you need encouragement. So do go and see your member of parliament, even if they're already on side, and make it very clear that your vote and your support will entirely depend on whether they get this right. That whatever else they get right, whatever else they get wrong, the fact is you are going to judge them because this is the existential issue, and being a steward is what you believe to be central to the human need.
Thank you very much. That's that's going to give us all a huge amount of food for thought, I think. Now, this one is a tricky one, but maybe I think this might be the last question that we have time for this evening. No, I've got two more actually. Right, this is the second, the penultimate question is, how do we get clergy and laity to change? That covers us, laity. How are we got to change?
Well, as far as everybody is concerned, first of all, we have to do it ourselves. We can't tell people what to do and then do the opposite ourselves. And that means that every choice that we make, every decision we make, we should be making through the lens of climate change. So we do have to say to ourselves, could we cut a number of our journeys in motor cars? Can we walk more? Can we just boil the amount of water in our kettles that we need for the cup of coffee and not a whole kettle full? Should we not make sure that we don't let the water run while we're cleaning our teeth? Every tiny thing like that we have to do. And we have to help other people to do it as well. As far as the clergy are concerned, I really do think that Laudato Si is absolutely central. I have a number of atheist friends who are scientists and who say that Laudato Si is the best introduction to climate change you could possibly have. So what we have got to do is to have every parish priest in Britain actually to take this seriously and be driving this as part of the Christian doctrine and message. This is applying the Gospels in today's problems. This is what we should be doing, and no parish should avoid having this as a central part of what the parish is doing. And that's true of Anglican parishes and non-conformist groups as far as it is from the Catholic Church. And I'm particularly concerned about those dioceses where this doesn't seem to yet to have become a driving force. And I'm very pleased with those, like, for example, the Diocese of Brentwood. You look at what is happening with the remarkable number of dioceses around the country where they're really, Middlesbrough, a number of other dioceses where they really are driving this. And then you look at some, and they shall be nameless, where it just isn't happening. Right. And I think we have just got to make it an absolute that the bishops in those dioceses are reminded just how important Laudato Si is.
Thank you very much. Well, there's just the very last question now. This one says, a friend of mine is a professor in oceanography in Germany, and he tells me that everything we are doing in the West will make 0.7% difference because the true size of the problem is the Far East. Is this your understanding? And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, of course, be doing all that we're doing, of course.
Well, I just think it's a misunderstanding of the way the world works. Look, if you take the world's biggest polluter, which is China, Why is it the world's biggest polluter? It's because we have exported our pollution to it. And we are buying all these products and a good deal of tat from the Chinese. We should be moving to a situation in which they are more able to meet the requirements that we have. And that means that we should be demanding that they make things with energy which is not costing the earth. Now, interestingly, I don't know about this professor, but I just have to say, China is already doing more proportionately than any other country. It's moving more quickly to renewable energy, and it's got a program which it clearly is going to meet. It's promised to get net zero by 2060, but that is 10 years too late. But actually, that's typical Chinese because they usually under promise and over deliver. So we've got to be a bit careful about this. Now, of course, it's true that there are more people in Asia, and they are, many of them, living in very poor circumstances and are seeking to have the same sort of life that we do. We have got to help them to move to that sort of life without destroying the earth on the way. And that's why one comes back to your first question, really. That is, what do we do to help the developing countries? That is crucial, hugely important. And that we have to do. So the idea that it somehow you measure it in the way that this professor has done seems to me to be false. The truth is, the rich countries have become rich, and all of us comparatively are rich because of pollution. We have become rich by doing the things that have endangered the world. The poor countries have not had the benefits of that. So there's a very simple moral position. We have to provide them with the ability to be able to create decent lives for their populations in a way which doesn't destroy the earth. And that's why the meeting in Azerbaijan is so important. That's why the whole issue of giving help to the developing countries is absolutely central. It's because only in that way will the rich be able to achieve a world which will maintain the standards which we have enjoyed. And so really, I come back to that professor. The truth is that almost 100% of what can be done has to be done by the rich.
Well, Lord Deben, thank you very, very much for a truly informative and inspiring evening, and I think deeply challenging to us all. And as it's only a short time to the next COP, I hope that that will have inspired us all to pay attention to the important issues that will be discussed in that. Thank you so much, and I think we can offer a round of applause online, so we will do that.
We're muted. No.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for giving up your evening and such generosity in allowing us to run over time. Apologies to those who might have been wanting to get back to their supper. I'm now going to hand over to Father Chris, who is going to give a final blessing to end the meeting.
May God, who can set creation free, show us his glory. May God, who knows our groaning and crying, bring about new life. May God, who helps us in our weakness, give us the first fruits of hope. And may the triune God sprinkle into our hearts the dew of his grace and bless us all. Amen.
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 Thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance, and thank you all for coming, and have a very good rest of evening. And thanks again